I was writing a ticket for a bald rear tire when dispatch told me to shut down the highway. That was my world before all this. Worn rubber, forged license plates, husbands who drank too much on market day. I was a rural police lieutenant, responsible for a slice of steppe, a handful of villages, and a length of cracked asphalt that never made the news. My name is Nulan Bekov. Back then, if you had asked what I did, I would have said I kept idiots from killing each other with cars. The man in the old larder leaned out his window, waving his arms. "Come on, Lieutenant, it still holds air. Look." My radio cut across his protest, sharp enough that I held up a hand and turned away. "Unit Bekov, acknowledge." I pressed the button. "Bekov, drop current stop. You are ordered to close highway segment between kilometer marker 20 and gas station at Aral Tobe. Full roadblock. Diversion only. Use cover story code 3. Cover story code 3 was chemical incident drill. Something with leaking tanks or a crashed fuel truck. We had used it once before for a joint exercise that never happened. "Reason?" I asked. "Exercise linked to space descent operation," the dispatcher answered. Her voice carried the flat cadence she used when she was reading from a paper someone else had handed her. "Higher authority. You have immediate priority. Space descent operation." That could mean anything from a routine Soyuz return to some experiment going wrong over our heads. I looked at the larder driver, at the empty steppe on both sides, at the long line of road stretching away toward nothing. Our stretch of highway usually stayed off the map when rockets fell. Someone far away was paying attention to it today. "Understood," I told the radio. "Closing segment. Send guidance for diversion routes." "Routes will follow. Start now." The driver leaned out again. "So? Ticket or what?" "Or what?" I jerked my chin. "Turn around. Highway is closed." He squinted past me. There were no flashing lights yet. No smoke. No hazard suits. "Closed for what?" "Chemical incident drill. Go back to the last junction and take the farm track south." He cursed under his breath, but he turned. I watched his taillights shrink, then motioned my 2 patrol cars into position across the lanes. We dragged rusty barricades out of the drainage ditch, the same ones we used when snow buried the road. My younger officer, Azamat, jogged over, cap skewed. "What happened?" He was in his 20s, still eager like the job was a stepping stone to something higher than this stretch of emptiness. "Exercise," I told him. "Some rocket stunt." He snorted. "They picked today to remember we exist. Help me get the signs up." We worked fast. Traffic here was thin. Trucks hauling grain or fuel, the odd bus, family cars headed toward the regional center. But once you started turning people around, they multiplied. In 10 minutes, we had a small queue. I gave the same line to all of them. "Chemical incident drill. No danger, just diversion." People grumbled. One woman in a minivan asked if it was the Chinese again. I did not bother to answer. I kept one ear on the outer channel, where other units reported minor preparations, and the other on the restricted channel, which stayed strangely busy and hushed at the same time. Lost station telemetry, flight dynamic anomaly, landing coordinates revised. Words like that floated in and out. They were not meant for me. They came from someone higher, passed through our little room in the regional center, and spilled onto my radio because the frequencies overlapped. I caught fragments about the International Space Station, about an experimental drive test, about orbit doing something it should not do. None of it sounded like a drill. Azamat drifted over again while I was waving a bus back. "You need to see this," he murmured. "I need to move these people." "It is from the landing zone. My cousin sent it. He is with emergency services. They got there first." He already had his phone out. I almost snapped at him, then caught the look in his eyes. It was not curiosity. It was stripped-down fear. "Quickly!" He cupped the phone low, thumb tapping. The video was flighty and shaky, the way all field clips are when the person holding the camera is also trying to work. I saw the capsule resting in the dry grass, the scorched track from air to ground. A line of emergency workers in bright vests and helmets moved toward it, step by step. This all looked familiar. Every year they drilled this kind of recovery on television. The hatch spun and swung outward. 3 figures climbed out in flight suits, dropping down one by one. They stood in a loose line. No one rushed them. The workers paced forward in a disciplined way, hands out, the same way we approached drunks on the highway at night. The image jumped as the man with the phone trotted to keep up. One technician reached one arm toward the first suited figure, just to steady him. In the next frame, the arm ended above the elbow. The rest of it was gone. The man's momentum carried what was left of him forward. The forearm, the hand, the tool he had been holding. Nothing of them showed anywhere. A neat bite had been taken from the soil where they should have been. Torn straps drifted down, cut ends of gear harness flapping. The camera jolted. A voice cried out once, sharp and wordless. The recording stopped. "Bullshit," I muttered, though my mouth felt dry. Azamat's thumb trembled on the pause icon. "My cousin does not fake things for fun." I handed the phone back. A truck horn blared. I turned and saw a line of vehicles now, several deep, drivers leaning out, arms spread. "Lieutenant, what are we supposed to tell them?" My other officer, Timur, called from the far lane. "Same thing," I answered. "Drill, diversion. No one goes through." "Until when?" "Until someone with more stars on the shoulder tells me different." I watched a pair of helicopters cross the sky far north, slanting toward the landing zone. One of them left a thread of smoke from some flare or exhaust. The other stayed clean against the pale blue. The space station, I thought, should be up there somewhere. We never see it with our eyes, but we know when it passes. People in the villages come outside for it, point children at the sky. Today they would be hiding inside, watching television if the signal still carried anything besides nervous announcers and stiff-faced generals. The radio barked again. "Unit Bekov, reroute. Take your team off the highway section and proceed toward farm cluster at Sarikuduk. Report structural damage if present. Keep road closed behind you. We will send another unit to hold." "Structural damage?" I repeated. Words from above. "Move." We shoved the barricades fully across the road, left a single patrolman to turn people back, and rolled out with the other 2 cars. Azamat drove, because he always drove too fast and it kept his hands busy. The farm road was just 2 tire tracks pressed into the steppe. Dust rolled up behind us, trailing us like a banner. "What do you think they mean? Structural damage?" he asked. "Something fell off the capsule. Maybe they put a dent in some old barn and want pictures for the report." "You saw the arm?" I did not answer. Ahead, the land dipped toward a shallow valley where a smudge of trees marked Sarikuduk. It was barely a village. A handful of farmhouses, a well, a rusted playground skeleton. As we crested the last rise, I saw the damage. At first, my brain tried to file it with storms and floods. A house roof missing after a gale. A wall collapsed after heavy snow. Except there had been no storm, and the shapes were wrong. One farmhouse had an outer wall that simply stopped halfway along its length. The rest of it had been lifted away in a clean corridor. Inside, one room remained, with a bed and a wardrobe clinging to the survivor wall. The next room, where there should have been a kitchen, had become open space running out into the field. Floorboards were sheared off. A table stood sliced through its center, cups resting on the remaining half. The farmer's tractor in the yard had lost its cab. The engine block was exposed, pipes and hoses cut short. The chassis rested on the ground as if nothing had happened. Azamat rolled to a stop. We climbed out. Up close, the edges where masonry stopped and nothing began were smooth at first glance, almost polished. When I ran a hand along a broken brick, it crumbled at the touch, as if it had sat in the sun for decades and then dried into dust overnight. Pipes ended in clean circles. A single electrical cable hung like a tendon, also cut and frayed at the same time. A man in overalls stood a few meters away, hands on his head. I recognized him, the Shekabayev boy, though he was a grown man now, skin burnt by years in the fields. His father had died the winter before. "What happened?" I asked. He jabbed a finger toward the fields beyond his fence. "They walked through," he answered. "3 of them." "What is they?" "The suits from the news, from the sky." His voice cracked. "I was at the barn. I saw them. They were far, just shapes. They walked like—" He mimed slow, steady steps. I went inside. I locked the door. I waited. I heard nothing. When I came out, the wall was gone. This part, the tractor, all gone. He pointed along a line that ran from one edge of his yard, through the house, finishing near the far ditch. If I squinted, I could trace a corridor of missing things. Half a fence, the cab of the tractor, a stretch of concrete slab, a chunk of the house. "They left you alone?" I asked. "I stayed inside." He rubbed his face with both hands, leaving pale streaks in the dust. "They did not look at me. I do not even know if they see." I turned my head, trying to match the angle of the missing corridor with the direction of the landing zone. It lined up roughly north to south. The suits, if that was what they were, had walked from Capsule to here in a straight line that cut through walls and machines the way a plough cuts through soil. "Any neighbours?" I asked. "Old woman in the next house. She's away visiting her sister in town. The others are at market." I keyed the radio. "Bekov, reporting." "Go ahead." "Farmhouse at Sarikuduk has partial structural loss. I see one corridor carved through building and yard, tractor damaged, no casualties found yet. One witness reports 3 suited figures moving past, matching landing zone description." They did not respond to him. "Distance to figures?" the dispatcher asked, and I heard another voice in the room behind her, clipped and impatient. "They have moved on," I answered. "I do not see them from here." "Mark coordinates. Do not approach any anomalous figures. Clear nearby households and move civilians away from the suspected line of movement." "Understood." Azamat still stared at the missing room. "You think it is a weapon?" "I think if it was ours, someone would be proud of it on television by now." We moved through the rest of the cluster. One shed down the hill had lost its roof. A chicken coop was sliced in half. The chickens had escaped and now wandered among the rubble. None of the animals looked hurt. They gave the missing wall edges a wide berth. We pushed on toward the small village beyond, calling ahead to the headman to warn him. On the way, we passed a grain truck in a shallow ditch. It rested on its side. The cab had vanished. The trailer, still full of grain, lay across the ditch at an angle, intact except for the front meter sheared away. The driver sat on the embankment, face blank. His hands shook as he lit a cigarette. "They walked through the road," he muttered as we approached. "I did what you are supposed to do, you know. I stayed in the cab. Vehicle is cover, they told us in those videos. That is what they said. I watched them in the mirror. Then the mirror was gone." He gestured at the empty air where the cab should have been. The steering column inside the trailer was cut off clean. "You did well to stay inside," I told him. It was automatic. The words felt useless in my mouth. "You are alive." "Am I?" He looked around like he expected the rest of him to vanish mid-breath. We got him into the back of my car. I told Azamat to drive him to the clinic in town. "I will stay," I said. "I want to see where they are headed." "I should stay with you," Azamat objected. "You have a survivor who might be going into shock. Take him in. Send Timur back when he is free." He hesitated, then nodded, and left. When the dust from his car settled, the road ahead looked stripped of everything human. No cars, no tractors, no pedestrians. Just steppe, and the faint line where the asphalt cut through it. I saw them a little while later, when I climbed a low rise past the village and looked north. 3 white suits moving across the grass. Even at that distance, something about them was off. It was the way they held their arms, slightly away from their bodies, as if they were wading through something none of us could see. They walked in a loose line, not close enough to touch. They did not look up or around. They did not hurry. I lifted binoculars, state issue, scratched at the edges. The faceplates gave me nothing back. Where there should have been glass, there was flatness. No depth, no shadow, no hint of a head inside. The interior of each suit was wrong in the same way. I could not tell if the limbs filled the fabric, or if it hung around some empty core. Behind and around them, their trail was becoming clearer. A fence missing its posts, but still holding sagging wire between empty spots. A concrete power pole cut off mid-height, glass insulators hanging on the remaining stump. A patch of road where the surface and the gravel under it had been removed in a rectangular block, leaving a shallow trench. They were angling toward a different village now, one with a proper shop and school and a bus stop. Beyond that, the line pointed toward the main road that eventually led to the regional city. My radio crackled. Unit Bekov, report. I have visual on 3 suited figures at approximate vector. I gave the best coordinates I could from memory. They are moving south toward Karashani village. Do not approach. You are authorized to establish outer cordon to divert civilians. You are to stay behind full military and emergency lines. Repeat, you do not engage. How many lines? I asked. Roscosmos recovery teams, ground forces, and an attached international biohazard unit are converging on the main axis. Your job is roads. Keep your sector clear. Roscosmos, the space agency, biohazard units, all for 3 suits that walked through walls and carved pieces out of tractors. I watched them for another moment, then turned back toward the cars. If my job was roads, I knew what needed doing next. I got to Karashani ahead of them by the length of 2 short cigarettes. The village headman, old Breckett, met me at the square, cap in his hands. You bring bad news, Lieutenant. There is an emergency situation moving this way, I told him straight. You saw the television? He nodded. His wife had a satellite dish. The whole village gathered there for big events. They walked through Sarikuduk, I added. You know Shekarbayev's place? He winced. Is he alive? Yes, his house is not. You need to get people on buses, tractors, anything with wheels, and head out on the old river road, not the main highway. You understand? Away from the line they are walking. Where will they go? He asked. South for now. That is all I know. He hesitated only a heartbeat, then started shouting names. People spilled out of houses, eyes wide and frightened. We had no sirens, just his voice and my presence in uniform. In a place like this, that was often enough. As they loaded, I kept my eyes on the northern road. The suits did not appear yet. The horizon stayed stock still. Timur drove up in the second car, dust-coated. Unit at the highway took over, he reported. They want us back at town when you are done here. Okay, help them load. Nobody stays. A woman grabbed my arm. You always tell us not to panic, she insisted. Is this real or some exercise? Do I look bored? I asked. Move. Take only what fits in the car. She looked at my face and did not ask again. We packed them in and rolled the convoy out along the river road. It was narrow, half gravel, but it stayed off the main arterial line that lay closer to the walker's path. I watched the buses kick up dust as they went. The kids in the back windows stared at me with big eyes, faces pressed to the glass. Only when they were out of sight did I let myself climb the water tower at the edge of the village. From there I had a clean view north and south. The suits were closer now, no longer tiny dots but clear shapes. They crossed a field, wading through waist-high grass. They never looked left or right. When one stepped onto a drainage ditch, the concrete lining in his path vanished, leaving clean dirt. When another brushed the corner of an old wooden shack, half the shack disappeared. The remaining half stood for a moment, then leaned and collapsed. They were not headed straight for Karashani anymore. Their line had bent slightly toward the main road, where the highway traffic I had closed earlier was now stacking up at the barricade. Maybe it was just terrain. Maybe not. Either way, I realized something then that I did not tell anyone for a long time. They were following the nerves of the land. Roads, power lines, fences, ditches, places where our world had cut and lined and wired itself. I climbed down and drove back toward town, watching the sky for helicopters. By the time night fell, they had set up the first field headquarters in a school gym. They took the children out and filled their place with maps. I walked into that gym tired and dust-stained, smelling of sweat and old chalk. My uniform still had the badge my daughter had once polished for a school ceremony, long before this. Now it just earned me a nod from the soldier at the door and a spot at the table where men with too many telephones crowded around a large printed satellite image of our region. Roscosmos had sent a liaison, a narrow man with glasses and a faded polo shirt. The army had sent a colonel in pressed camouflage and boots that had never seen our mud. The emergency services director from the regional center stood between them, hair pulled back in a knot so tight it made her face look carved. Someone had tacked school posters to the wall and then forgotten to take them down. Next to the big map of the steppe, a cartoon fox urged children to wash their hands. A projector showed footage from the landing zone on the wall opposite the hoop. They ran the clip I had seen on Azamat's phone, but in higher resolution. The technician's missing arm, the bite out of the soil, the way fabric straps and cables swung through emptiness where his limb had been. Then they ran new footage from a different angle, taken by the attached American team. This time, they zoomed in on the faceplate of the nearest suit. Up close it was worse. The glass or plastic or whatever material should have reflected the sun. Instead, it looked like someone had cut a hole in the film. Sensors saw only empty returns where there should have been a highlight or an image of the surroundings. The Roscosmos man tapped the screen with a pointer. Analyzing the reflection returns 0, he explained. No specular highlight, no image of surroundings. The sensors report null values over and over. Imagine a broken pixel in a photograph but hanging in the air. The colonel grunted. Can we shoot it? The Roscosmos man flicked to a later clip. Soldiers fired rubber bullets and then live rounds from a safe distance. Everything that hit the suits vanished at contact, leaving neat bites in the earth behind them. A remote-controlled vehicle armed with explosives drove into the path, then disappeared from the waist up when one of the suits brushed it. The remaining undercarriage rolled on for a few meters and fell over. We can fire at it, the Roscosmos man answered. That is all we have learned so far. The emergency director looked at me. Lieutenant Bekov, you have been closest to them in the field today. What did you see? I felt all eyes swing my way. I was not used to that in a room full of higher ranks. They cross land in a line, I said. What they walk through disappears along a corridor. At Sarikuduk, they carved through one house and a tractor. At the grain truck, the cab was gone, trailer remained. The corridor is narrow enough that people outside it survive. Random pattern, the colonel concluded. Maybe, I answered. They follow some direction. When they reach a ditch or a fence, they take part of it. When there is nothing, they just walk. The Roscosmos man leaned on the table. From orbital tracking, we see small anomalies in the Earth's gravity field along the corridor they are carving. Instruments like pendulums drift slightly off true near the path. Stones thrown across the line curve. Our colleagues have detected fragments of missing infrastructure at altitude and in deep ground. Think of a moving surface where our world touches another and swaps material. A portal, the colonel translated, lips twisting around the foreign word. They are trading pieces of our world with somewhere else. The important part is that matter reappears, the scientist added. Sections of guardrail from one highway found embedded in permafrost hundreds of kilometers away. A chunk of cable recovered by a weather balloon in the upper atmosphere. The field displaces things. It does not erase them. Nothing alive has been recovered. Only things. I thought of the technician's missing arm. What are they doing here? The emergency director asked quietly. Either malfunctioning remnants of the station experiment, the scientist answered, or probes behaving exactly as they were designed to behave. I am not sure which answer is worse. They all started talking at once then, about orbits and responsibility and treaty obligations. I let it wash over me while I studied the map on the table. Someone had traced the walker's path so far in red. Landing zone, Sarikuduk, Karashani's outskirts. The line bent slightly as it passed each populated area, more so than terrain alone would explain. When the villagers ran toward the old river road, I heard myself say, the suits tilted toward the main highway instead. They turned towards me again, annoyed at the interruption. What? The colonel demanded. When we pushed people off the highway, they hesitated for a moment, then chose the path with more structures. The main road, not the farm tracks. And earlier, near the highway, I saw them drift toward the traffic queue at our barricade. So they prefer infrastructure, the colonel answered. We can use that. Herd them with roads and power lines. And with concentrations of people, I added. They seem to drift towards stress. The Roscosmos man frowned. How do you measure stress from a water tower, Lieutenant? I do not, I answered. I just watched. When people panic, they move together. They shout, they drive in clumps. That made a bigger target. The colonel dismissed it with a wave. We cannot build a plan around feelings. Roads and cables we can map, blast, rebuild. The emergency director looked unsettled. We should at least consider civilian behavior in the models. Of course, the colonel answered, already writing on the map. But first we build corridors. Lieutenant Bekov, you know these roads better than anyone in this room. You will help draw a route that keeps those things away from the main population centers. We will redirect, close, reroute, and if needed, sacrifice some useless warehouses and farm lots. The city must stand. The word sacrifice hung in the air without anyone wanting to touch it. He drew a thicker line around the regional city, then a curve through the old industrial zone on its outskirts. Warehouses, depots, fuel tanks, places with more rust than people. If we can nudge their path through here, he went on, then bend them away toward the deserted test range beyond, we can limit civilian casualties. Limit, the emergency director repeated. There is no version of this with none, he answered. We choose where the cuts go. They built the first plan that night. I stood there and watched them decide which areas could be written off. I pointed out bridges and bottlenecks, roads that could be blocked with a handful of trucks, farm tracks that would let people slip away if we warned them early. I did not mention that old Shekabayev's surviving walls lined up almost exactly with a buried fiber optic cable. It felt too small a detail, too strange, and I did not want to sound like a man chasing ghosts through the ground. When the meeting broke, they gave me a cot in a classroom with a dozen other officers. I did not sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw clean cuts through houses and men. In the morning, the orders came with full stamps and signatures. We were to turn human traffic into bait. The colonel's corridor plan depended on one thing: drawing the walkers into zones where damage to infrastructure and stockpiled goods was acceptable and away from dense housing. To do that, they needed visible motion and noise in those sacrificial zones, and relative calm elsewhere. On paper, it looked clinical. Evacuation routes A, B, and C. Priority flows along industrial belts and over underused bridges. Delayed evacuations in certain suburbs to avoid adding panic in the wrong areas. On the road, it was me and my men standing at intersections lying to people. They gave us message templates over radio. Calm voice, key phrases, instructions to repeat. I threw half of them out. Rural people smell condescension faster than gas leaks. They would trust my face and my uniform more than any distant broadcast. We set up at a crossroads where the main highway forked toward the city, or toward the old industrial district. Anyone coming from my villages would hit that fork. The colonel wanted their vehicles directed down the industrial branch into the corridor to make that road look busy and important. That would lure the walkers toward it, away from the city proper. Azamat returned before dawn after dropping the survivor at the town clinic. He leaned on the hood of our car, watching as a first bus pulled up. Its windshield had a cardboard sign jammed under the wiper with the name of one of our smaller villages in blue pen. I climbed up onto the step. "You are going to the city?" I asked the driver. "Where else?" He jerked his chin toward the horizon. "My brother lives by the stadium. They say nothing will get that far in." "You need to take the industrial road," I told him. "The main highway is jammed with base traffic and official convoys. This way is faster." He frowned. "Faster to what? Warehouses?" "There is a new reception point in the depots." I lied smoothly. Years of pulling over drunk cousins prepared me well for this kind of thing. "Less crowded. Better for children." A chorus of small faces watched me from the bus windows. A woman in the second row clutched a baby. No one challenged me. I had a uniform and a radio. That was enough. "Industrial road it is," the driver muttered, turning the wheel. We waved him through, then the next truck, then a convoy of private cars, all toward the warehouses and sheds that the colonel had quietly marked with a red cross on his private copy of the map. It did not feel heroic. It felt like moving pieces on a game board where some pieces bled and some did not. I told myself that every bus going that way was a bus not sitting in a tight queue on a main artery near the city centre. If the walkers bent toward the busy road instead of a sleeping block of flats, that was a win, no matter how ugly it looked. I left one road off the corridor map, the small concrete strip that ran past my own village. When the colonel's staff asked me to mark it, I shrugged and said it was too narrow for heavy vehicles, not worth factoring. That was only partly true. It could take passenger cars and tractors just fine. I wanted it clear. "You are sure?" the staff officer pressed. "We could run a smaller line there." "Sure," I answered. "It is a dead end at the river. No point tempting traffic in." I told myself I was just being practical. In my gut, I knew what I was doing, carving out one thin thread of safety in the net so that the people I knew best might wriggle through. We spent that entire day steering flows. Every time I looked north, the suits were closer. The military units tried tricks of their own. They flew helicopters near the path. They set off controlled blasts on distant hills, hoping noise and pressure waves would tug the walkers one way or another. Sometimes it seemed to work. Sometimes the suits ignored them and drifted toward a road jammed with civilian cars instead. Near nightfall, we witnessed our first rail test. It took place along the freight line that cut across the steppe halfway between my sector and the city edge. The scientists had convinced the colonel that if they could tag the missing pieces from an arranged scene, they might learn more about where everything was going. They loaded obsolete machinery and scrap onto flat cars. They painted bright markers on some parts. They rolled the train across the walker's predicted path and then waited with cameras and sensors. My unit was there only to keep curious locals away and maintain a security ring. We parked our cars at a distance and watched as the suits approached. The first one stepped onto the tracks. The rails under his boots broke into gaps. Segments vanished ahead and behind him, leaving the sleepers bare. The sleepers stayed, but metal had simply peeled out of sections of the walkway. Then he walked through the flat cars. The metal around his limbs disappeared. Cargo and beams tore apart where the corridor passed. A crane arm toppled. Painted tags went with the missing sections. Unpainted pieces hung in mid-air for a second without supports, then crashed to the side. Holy Mother! Azamat breathed beside me. He was too young to remember much of the old religion, but in moments like this, everyone reaches for old words. Scientists near the tracks cheered, then hushed as they saw something go wrong. A worker in a hard hat had stepped closer than he should to adjust a patterned panel the scientists wanted placed exactly in the path. He stumbled on loose ballast and threw out one arm to catch his balance. He stumbled forward into the line as a suit passed. The erasure took him from the waist down. His upper body fell, hands clawing at gravel that suddenly had no ground under it. There was no spray of blood, no shreds of flesh. He landed with a dull thump, torso and arms intact, legs simply not there. His hard hat rolled away in a neat arc. Time contracted. For a second, no one moved. Then his colleague lunged forward and grabbed his shoulders. "Get back!" I ran toward them before I realized I had started. There was no second wave of erasure. Whatever had passed through him had moved on with the suit. We hauled the upper half of the man away from the tracks. His eyes darted back and forth as he tried to understand a body that no longer matched his nerves. The doctor from the biohazard team dropped beside him, snapping gloves onto his hands, barking orders for bandages that would never be needed. Azamat turned away and retched. "Do not look at the cut," I told him. "Look at his face if you cannot look at anything else." "Why?" he asked, wiping his mouth. "Because that is what we might be later, if we are lucky." That was the wrong thing to say, but it came out anyway. The suits walked on, indifferent. The scientist in charge barely glanced at the man on the ground before turning back to his instruments. "We got good coverage," he muttered to his team. "Multiple angles, sensor packages functioning." Later we heard their results. A tagged pipe from the flat cars appeared embedded in deep ice far north, discovered when a drilling team sent back images of bright paint on metal in a layer that should have been centuries old. A marked panel showed up in atmosphere, intersected by a high-altitude balloon. They confirmed that the field moved matter elsewhere, not out of existence. When they told us at the field headquarters that night, the colonel slapped the table. "Good," he said. "If it is not pure destruction, maybe we can choke it with junk." The emergency director stared at him. "We just watched it cut half a man away like a piece of pipe." "It did that too," he answered. "But at least now we know they are not erasing the planet into nothing." I kept my mouth shut. I was thinking of how the lower half of the worker's body would be resting somewhere now, still in uniform trousers and boots, maybe embedded in some alien soil or floating in some unreachable region of the sky. There would be no funeral for that part. No one would ever visit it. After the test, my trust in the people behind the maps began to fray. They had risked a man to get readings they could brag about on some classified report. When they talked about acceptable losses, they meant one thing on paper and something else entirely in the dirt. That did not change my orders. I was still in charge of roads. If I walked away, someone less scrupulous would take my place, and my villagers would have no one who cared enough to bend orders at the edges. So I stayed. As the walkers approached the city, the headquarters grew like a tumor. They expanded from the school gym into tents, then into parked trucks with antenna masts and blinking equipment. More uniforms arrived. Some wore our badges, some wore Moscow badges, some wore other flags entirely. The colonel's plan grew with the headquarters. He wanted a grand corridor sweeping along the industrial belt surrounding the city, then bending away toward an old weapons test range. No one had lived near that range for years, not officially. He was happy to feed it warehouses, tracks, power stations, whatever it took. The emergency director fought for stricter evacuations instead. She wanted the ring roads closed, civilian traffic banned near the predicted path, all experiments stopped. She had not seen any of her proposals win the argument yet. They did not really need my opinion for these fights, but they kept me in the room as a piece of local colour, and because I knew which roads actually existed versus which ones were still on maps from the last century. In places like ours, official charts lie. The earth moves, farmers carve new tracks, old bridges crumble. If you plan around the wrong document, you send thousands of people down a road that no longer reaches the bridge you think it does. One afternoon, the emergency director pulled me aside in the corridor, away from the colonel and his staff. "Lieutenant," she asked, "if you had to choose where they go, what would you pick? Be honest." "I am not paid enough for that choice," I answered. "No one is. We still have to make it." I thought of the worker on the tracks, the housing blocks around the city we had patrolled on routine calls, the fields around my village. "I would try to keep them where they already are," I said finally. "Industrial belt, freight yards, empty testing grounds." "And when they do not stay there?" she pressed. "Then we improvise." She nodded slowly. "That is exactly what I am afraid of." The colonel, for his part, loved clear lines. His corridor through the industrial belt was drawn bold and thick on the latest map, with arrows and timetables and demolition symbols. He pushed for resources to rig key overpasses and bridges with explosives, to be fired at just the right moments to close paths behind the walkers and keep them in the channel. In the modelling room, where our map sat next to screens showing live feeds from satellites, someone had started overlaying colours for stress density, rough measures of where people were most anxious based on communications traffic, calls to emergency lines, and movement data. The Roscosmos man wanted to factor that into the projections. The colonel called it astrology with algorithms. "If we start chasing people's feelings on a map, we will never finish," he argued. "Roads are solid, bridges are solid, warehouses are solid. We break and build those. People we just push around, same as always." He was wrong, but I did not realize how badly yet. On the morning the corridor plan went into full effect, I was posted at a major overpass that straddled the main ring road and a branch leading into the industrial zone. Engineers had wired the support pillars with shaped charges. Their fingers hovered over tablets that would send the signal when the colonel gave the word. We could watch the suits approaching on a nearby screen. Small glowing icons on the wider map, live video feed in one corner. They carved through countryside, through rail yards outside our view, leaving jagged emptiness behind them. "The moment they cross under this bridge," the engineer briefed us, "you clear back here. We blow the southern supports. The deck drops behind them, and they have one less line back toward the dense housing in Sector 4. They will be steered into the depots." "Unless they decide they like our steps more than your arrows," Azamat muttered under his breath. We had argued about that the night before. He was starting to see what I saw. The subtle bends in their path when crowds formed. The way they angled through busy junctions even when quieter, more direct routes lay open. "Do your job," I told him. "Let the colonel worry about their taste." "Colonel worries about the colonel's career," he answered. But he did not push it further. He knew where my line was when it came to talking back in front of outsiders. We watched them arrive. On the screen, 3 suits entered the camera's field of view. They passed through a railway siding, carving pieces out of trains that had not been moved in years. They clipped the corner of an old fuel tank. The tank did not explode. It just lost a chunk of radius and became a misshapen cylinder. Then they stepped under our bridge. Up close, they were bigger than they looked from the water tower. Not giants, just human-sized. But the field around them reached wider than their bodies. Asphalt vanished around their boots. The air shimmered in a way that made my eyes want to slide away. "Now," the engineer hissed, then caught himself and raised his tablet to his chest. "Trigger on command." The colonel's voice came through the radio. "Wait for the third one," he ordered. "We want them all in." The first suit passed through the shadow of the deck. The second followed, pace unbroken. The third stepped onto the painted lane marker and kept going. "Now!" the colonel's voice snapped. The engineer tapped. The charges went off with a sharp crack and a single heavy thump. The southern supports blew inward. Concrete and steel gave way. The deck slumped, then dropped in segments. Half the bridge fell behind the walkers, blocking the road they had just come from. Dust billowed. The suits did not flinch. They walked on, out from under the remaining span, into the industrial zone. Cheers went up from some of the soldiers on the embankment. It felt like we had done something to shape their path. "Do not celebrate yet," I muttered. "It is a long city." For the next hours, the corridor worked. The walkers moved through warehouses. They left holes where they passed, taking roof beams and cranes and pallet rows. They cut through a transit yard, shearing containers in neat slices. No one alive was allowed near them. We parked people at distances measured on the map by men who claimed to know what safe meant when dealing with an absence that ate reality. Then stress began to leak. Some of it we caused ourselves. Sirens, announced as a precaution in certain districts, triggered panic when people realized officials were only telling half the truth. Social networks flooded with unofficial clips. Men vanished at the capsule, the half-body on the tracks, houses cut open like boxes. Rumors claimed the suits were turning toward the heart of the city, even as our corridor showed them hugging the industrial ring. A small protest flared outside the regional government building. People who had lost family in Sarikuduk and the rail test gathered with hand-painted signs, demanding full transparency. Security forces tried to push them back. Phones filmed everything. The crowd swelled. Fists flew. Rocks hit windows. On the stress map, which I had learned to read like weather, a bright hot spot blossomed there. At the same time, a residential block on the edge of the corridor, which had been told it was out of the projected danger zone, started its own evacuation. Someone there had seen our latest maps and realized how close the red line now came. People jammed into cars and onto buses, honking, shouting, trying to push through narrow streets that had not been designed for mass exodus. Another bright patch bloomed on the stress overlay, almost touching the corridor. The colonel insisted on keeping his eyes on his own markers. "They are in the industrial belt," he grunted. "Our arrows still hold." But I watched the live feed from a drone circling above the walkers. Their line was no longer smooth. It began to cant inward. "They are bending," Azamat whispered next to me, "toward that block." We did not need to name which one. I knew it. Dom 7 in Sector 4. A line of grey buildings with small balconies where laundry hung on better days. 2 days before, I had stood in its courtyard in front of a group of residents and told them calm lies. "We have corridors laid out through the warehouses," I had reassured them. "You are not in the prime risk zone. Stay off the roads unless you receive a direct order. Panic just draws more attention." One of my old sergeants, Nolanov, lived there with his sister and her kids. He had moved in after his divorce, close to work, far from the debts he had run up out in the villages. When I left that courtyard, he had clapped my shoulder. "Good to hear it is not our turn," he had joked. Now it was. The drone feed showed the suits cutting through the last of the warehouses and stepping toward the residential district. They were not making a neat 90-degree turn. Nothing that simple. They were drifting, a slow arc that brought their path through the edge of the block I had promised safety. I grabbed my radio. "This is Bekov at overpass Sector 3, I snapped. "Divert me to Sector 4 residential, nearest access to Dom 7. I am going." The colonel's voice came back instantly. "Negative. Stay at your post. We need you for the next bridge drop." "They are about to cut through a block you marked safe," I said. "If we do not get those people out now, they die for our mistake." "Your mistake," he cut in. "You were the one who reassured them. Stay where you are." He was right. He used the truth like a knife. I dropped the radio on my seat and turned to Azamat. "Take the wheel. Full siren, Sector 4. He gripped the steering wheel and looked at me hard for a heartbeat. Then he turned the key. We barreled off the overpass with the siren wailing. Other units scattered to let us through. Smoke from demolished supports curled in our wake. It took longer than it should have to reach Dom 7. Every intersection had some blockage. A stalled car left in panic. A truck driver trying to back out of a lane that had become a funnel of fleeing vehicles. We banged fenders, scraped mirrors, swore at people who froze in front of us. By the time we arrived, the walkers were crossing the outer ring road a few blocks away. Dom 7's courtyard was chaos. People dragged bags and crates toward cars. Kids cried. The head of the building committee flailed at them with a clipboard, trying to impose some last-minute order. I jumped out of the car and climbed onto the hood. "Listen," I shouted, using the tone I had honed over years of breaking up fights outside roadside bars. "You have two options. Leave now on foot toward the stadium, do not look back, or stay inside and take your chances. You do not have time to load everything you own." Someone yelled back, "You told us we were safe here." "I was wrong," I answered. The words came out without adornment. "Move." That got their attention more than any apology would have. People started to run toward the street that led away from the approaching suits. They left doors open behind them. Grandmothers clung to grandchildren. A man tried to carry both a television and his son at once, until his wife ripped the television from his arms and hurled it aside. "Sergeant Nulanov," I called, scanning faces. He appeared in a doorway, breathless. "Third floor. Aunt will not leave." "Then you have a choice," I told him. "Get her down or get yourself out." He glared at me and turned back into the stairwell. The suits crossed into the district's outer fringe. You could feel them before you saw them, not in some mystical way, but in the way the environment reacted. A line of streetlights went flat as their bulbs vanished one by one. A parked delivery van lost its front half, then toppled. A patch of asphalt dropped into a shallow trench where a segment had been removed. The absence moved like a tide that only took, never left. People screamed. Someone tried to reverse a car into a spot it did not fit. Others trampled over knocked-over bicycles and each other. "Leave the vehicles," I bellowed. "You are faster on foot. Go toward the stadium." Most listened. Enough did not. I saw the first suit step into the courtyard through the gap between two buildings. It moved at the same steady pace as always. It did not seem to notice the people at all, yet its path intersected with lives. It brushed a balcony. Half of it vanished. A clothesline that had been strung there sagged down abruptly where its anchor had disappeared. It stepped through the stairwell. The building split. The cut exposed a cross-section of life more ragged than the farmhouse. Rooms lay open like boxes torn sideways, furniture stranded on half floors, appliances sliced in two, beds missing their foot ends, a row of shoes, some pairs now short a partner, and people. I saw one man at a kitchen table, frozen mid-reach, his arm ending at the shoulder where the corridor had passed. The table lost a leg and pitched. He toppled with it. Halfway up the stairwell, Sergeant Nolanov's torso slid forward onto the remaining steps. His lower body was gone. His sister reached for him, then jerked her hands back when she realized the line between existence and nothing was inches from her toes. Our eyes met, all three of us, me in the courtyard, him on the stairs, her clinging to the railing. There was nothing to say. I could not drag him anywhere that would help. He could not move. She could not cross the line without risking her own body. The suit walked on, carving through the rest of the block. When it passed, what remained began to sag. Supports that were meant to connect through walls and beams now ended at empty space. A balcony collapsed. A segment of roof slid down like a card in a trick game. We pulled everyone we could reach away from the newly revealed edges. Medics from the emergency teams rushed in once the corridor had moved on. They tied tourniquets where there were limbs left to tie. They covered bodies with sheets when there were enough pieces to make a body. The other two suits followed their companion through the block, cutting fresh lines through adjoining buildings. They emerged on the far side without variation in gait, still angling on their slow arc beyond the residential district and back towards the industrial ring. Later, in the gym, they would argue about why the path had bent. The Roscosmos man pointed to the stress map, to the protests and the fleeing vehicles. The colonel jabbed his finger at the arrangement of buildings and power lines. "Too much density," he insisted. "You cannot steer them perfectly with this much clutter. Terrain eats plans." He never mentioned contact with fear. The emergency director, listening to the casualty reports from Dom 7 and the surrounding blocks, looked at me with a kind of exhausted accusation. "You promised them," she murmured. "I did," I answered. "On your behalf, on his behalf, on mine." "And then you disobeyed to try to fix it." "Yes." "How many did you save by breaking orders?" I had no number. Hundreds had evacuated because we showed up. Others had frozen and died anyway. The suits did not care about our logic. Azamat sat on a bench nearby, staring at his boots. His hands still shook slightly. He had carried a boy out of a stairwell minutes before the cut passed, only because the child had dropped his toy and stopped to pick it up. Tiny chance, tiny difference between living and being sliced in two. After Dom 7, the city stopped trusting our maps. People no longer believed the red and green zones. Every rumor was taken as truth. Streets that we needed for military convoys turned into rivers of fleeing cars. The stress map looked like a sheet of metal pushed into fire. The Colonel's corridor began to leak. The walkers still passed through parts of it, destroying warehouses and depots as planned, but they also made small deviations toward fresh knots of panic. It became clear that we were not building a neat channel through empty structures. We were laying trails of bait through our own nervous system. And the bait was not just concrete and steel, but any place where humans clumped. The end game for me came at a crossroads. The suits had cut through enough suburbs and depots that we could no longer keep them entirely away from the city core or the outer districts. They were approaching a region where any bend in their path would either take them through the main government district and central hospitals, or send them out into the rural belt beyond the ring road. The stress map showed two bright potential attractors. One was the city centre, where if people were warned clearly, they would panic hard and crowd the streets. The other was my home region, the villages and small towns outside the ring, connected by a handful of highways and dirt tracks. I was in the communications truck staring at those maps when the emergency director and the colonel both called in at once. "Lieutenant Bekov," the director's voice came over one line, thin and strained. "We need honest warnings in sectors 1 through 3. People must know they are at risk. If we lie again, we repeat Dom 7. "Lieutenant," the colonel's voice cut across another channel, sharp as a baton. "Your priority is to maintain calm in the city centre. If those suits bend inward, we lose civilian leadership, hospitals, the only functioning logistics. You will direct your alerts to the outer districts. They are more dispersible." Dispersible. That was his word. "Clarify," I requested, though I understood too well. "Play down danger in sectors 1 through 3, he repeated. "You will issue general preparedness messages only. No sirens inside the ring. In outer districts and rural areas, you will activate full alerts. Encourage them to move outward along designated corridors." I looked at the map. The designated corridors outward ran straight through my home district. If we triggered full alarms there, people would pour onto the highways in every vehicle they owned. They would clog the farm roads, the little tracks I had left off the earlier sacrifice plan. Stress would spike, a bright flare of fear. The suits were already leaning slightly that way. A strong enough draw would make the arc decisive. If, instead, we kept the outer belts calmer and warned the city centre, the flare would bloom inside the ring. The walkers might bend inward instead, carving through administrative buildings, hospitals and dense towers. There was no version where both sets were spared. "You want me to choose who screams first?" I said to the empty space of the truck. No one on either channel contradicted that. My hand hovered over the control panel. One set of switches would activate sirens and emergency messages in the center. Another set controlled the outer belts, the automated calls that would ring through the villages and highway service areas, telling people to run. I thought of my daughter living with her mother in the city, near a hospital where her new husband worked. I thought of my parents' graves in the village cemetery, already there, not going anywhere. I thought of my sister still running the little shop by the bus stop, counting cigarettes and loaves. I also thought of what the colonel would do if the city core was gutted. Martial law. Blame. "Lieutenant," the emergency director urged, "be straight with the people in the center. They deserve to know." "Lieutenant," the colonel barked, "if you trigger panic there, you doom all of us. Follow the plan." The habit of obedience runs deep when you wear a uniform long enough. So does the habit of choosing the option you think will let you work off your guilt later. I took a breath. "Alerting outer districts," I told them. "Moving city center to preparedness, posture only." I flipped the switches. In the villages beyond the ring, sirens began to wail. Automated voices crackled through loudspeakers at rural police stations and cultural halls, telling people to leave, to pack quickly, to expect road closures. Television and radio crawls in those zones switched to bright banners and urgent fonts. Inside the ring, the messages that went out were calmer. "Stay indoors. Await further instruction. Do not panic. Authorities are in control." The sirens stayed silent. I hung up on both channels before either the colonel or the director could answer. Azamat stood in the doorway of the truck. He had heard enough to piece together what I had done. "Who did you just feed to them?" he asked. I could not tell if there was accusation in his tone or just disbelief. "I gave the city a chance to keep functioning," I answered. "I gave us a chance to fight this again somewhere else." "You gave your own village away," he replied. "Yes." We drove back to the overpass and watched the map update. The stress in the outer belt surged. Scared voices flooded police lines out there. People shoved belongings into cars. Confrontations flared at every intersection as drivers tried to cut each other off. On the screen, the suit icons shifted. Their path had been angling somewhere between the center and the outer belt, a fuzzy potential. Now it tightened. The line curved outward, pulled by the flare of panic I had ignited. They stepped past the last big factory, then across a field, and then out beyond the ring road onto the smaller network of village highways and farm tracks. They walked toward my home. I watched from the overpass as they crossed the distant horizon. I could not see the details from there, just the way sections of road disappeared. And then, a breath later, the roofs and walls of farmhouses suddenly showed edges where none had been. Later we would get the drone footage. Later we would catalogue which villages were cut in half and which were spared as the suits traced their corridor through the countryside. At that moment, it was enough to know that every clean bite through a house out there, every vanished patch of earth, was a result of what I had just done with my fingers on a panel of switches. I expected to be arrested. For a while, it looked like that might happen. After the crisis entered its slow phase, when the suits finally left our region and moved out into a no-man's land of test ranges and deserts, commissions formed. Men with notebooks arrived from the capital. They interviewed everyone who had held any authority during the event. In the rooms where they questioned me, the air always felt too still. There was a camera in the corner, a pitcher of water on the table, a list of names and dates on the paper in front of the lead investigator. They asked about Sari Kuduk, about the rail test, about Dom 7. They asked why I had disobeyed the colonel to rush there. They asked why I had chosen to activate sirens in the outer districts instead of the city centre in those final hours. "You understand," one of them concluded, "that your choice directly influenced the entity's final path through the rural belt." "Yes," I answered. "That was the point. Many of those people were your relatives or neighbours, or customers from your jurisdiction." "Yes, and yet you sacrificed their settlements to spare the core." "I chose to give one cluster a chance to keep some order. Out there we would have had chaos and collapse plus the entities. In here we just had the entities, or so I thought." "Do you regret it?" he asked. "Regret is not a useful category. I can list consequences instead if you prefer." He made a note. I never saw what he wrote. My family situation simplified the politics. My parents were already gone. My ex-wife and our daughter lived near the hospital, where the suits never passed thanks to my choice. My sister's shop lay on the path. It was cut clean through the center. They found her ledger later, half missing entries. There was no body to recover, just absence where she had stood. If I had done the opposite, some committee would be sitting with her alive and my daughter dead. I do not know which version my interrogators would have preferred. In the end, they chose not to bring me to trial. There are practical reasons for that. Trials create records. They create expectations of precedent. What they needed instead of a villain was a quiet system for dealing with whatever came next. When the questioning phase ended, they called me into a smaller room with no camera. A woman from the National Security Service sat there, flanked by two men in suits. She had files in front of her, thick enough to hold the lives of several people. "Lieutenant Beckhoff," she began, "your actions contributed to both the damage and the containment in your region." "I am aware," I answered. "You showed a willingness to make hard choices and to work within and around orders as needed. You have also demonstrated a clear understanding of how civilian behavior interacts with anomalous phenomena. We have need of this experience." "Where?" I asked. She slid one folder across the table. Inside were satellite images of other regions, other continents. I saw a highway in another country with a neat block missing from its center. A farm field somewhere overseas where a circle of ground had simply not grown this season. A desert with a straight-line trench that did not match any known geological feature. "Since the event here," she explained, "we have detected smaller manifestations elsewhere. Short-lived corridors, minor absences, fragments appearing without obvious source. Nothing on the scale of the three suits yet, but enough to suggest that the interface is not finished with us." Interface. That was how they talked now. Not monsters or invaders in their briefings, but a point of contact. A polite word for the place where pieces of our world get traded elsewhere. "We are assembling a joint task group," she went on, "domestic and international. Its mandate is to monitor, model, and manage further incidents. That will include deciding where to allow cuts and where to prevent them, within the bounds of what is possible. We believe you can help." "And if I refuse?" I asked. She smiled without warmth. "Then you will be retired for health reasons. You will not be allowed to travel. You will live under supervision in a region that still has roads. You may one day see your story told by others who were not there, in ways you might find unsatisfying. And if I accept? You will be relocated to a secure facility. You will work with analysts and field officers. You will have a voice in how we respond, and in which places we choose to defend and which we let go. You will not talk about your work to anyone outside the group, including your family. What makes you think I want that kind of responsibility again? You kept taking it every time we handed you a map." She was right. I had volunteered for nothing and agreed to everything. It was a pattern as much as any corridor on the stress map. I signed. They moved me to a facility on the edge of the capital, in a building that looked like any other government block from the outside. Inside, it housed screens and maps and analysts who had never walked through dust behind a patrol car. They welcomed me as a curiosity, the man who had stood under the first corridor's shadow and come back with his body in one piece. My first day, they showed me the live feed from a small town in another country. Overnight, a straight scar had appeared through a set of houses on its outskirts. No one reported suits. No one saw anything walk. In the morning, there was just a line of missing things and a handful of reappeared fragments in a field several 100 kilometers away. "We think of these as splinters from the original event," the analyst explained. "Minor exchanges. They come and go quickly, but the frequency is increasing." They had new terms now: micro-corridors, spontaneous trades, steady-state adjustments. Every new phrase was a way to pretend that what happened was becoming normal, manageable. "We want you," he continued, "to help us shape the response models. You know what happens on the ground when you tell people one thing and mean another. You know how they move under stress." He turned on another layer on the map. It showed communications patterns, call volumes, all the digital noise people generate when scared. "You will tell us," he said, "where we can afford to frighten people and where we cannot." Weeks later, they flew me back over my region in a helicopter. Officially, it was so I could brief them on how the land looked now. Unofficially, it was a test to see if I could still do the job with the trench of my own making visible under the rotors. From the air, the corridor through the rural belt looked like a scar carved by a giant blade. Fields ran right up to its edges, crops on one side, bare earth on the other. Houses that had been cut half remained as shells, some propped up with beams, some left to sag. My village was gone. Where the main street had been, there was a wide absence. The cemetery lay partly intact, a row of graves sliced through so that some headstones now fronted nothing. The shop where my sister had kept her ledgers was half smear, half room. The interior wall was open to the sky. Someone had hammered a wooden cross into the ground near the center of the missing zone. It leaned slightly, wrapped with ribbons in the national colors. People had left flowers along the edge, not where any particular body lay, but along the line that marked where their world stopped. At one point along the trench, I saw something foreign. A section of city guardrail, the type used in a different region entirely, was embedded in the soil at an angle. It did not belong there. Its paint was fresh, its bolts bright, as if it had been dropped from nowhere and driven into our earth. A piece traded in from some other corridor. Later in the facility, we catalogued more fragments like that. Bits of playground equipment turning up in deserts. Sections of mountain road laid into flat plains. The exchange was not one way. Whatever lived on the other side was giving us scraps back without care for where they landed. Sometimes, in quiet hours when the analysts had gone for the day, I sat alone in the map room and traced potential future paths with my finger. They called these exercises scenario planning. To me, it felt like drawing fate in pencil. "What if another 3 suits appear here?" I would murmur, "on the edge of this coastal city? Do we herd them inland through old industrial zones at the cost of towns? Or do we let them carve through port infrastructure and choke off trade for a decade? If a micro-corridor opens near a dam, do we evacuate downstream and risk drawing a larger path there, or keep quiet and pray the interface does not notice?" The others would come in later and turn my sketches into models. They would argue about acceptable losses. They would wrap their calculations in new terms. But the core of it stayed the same. Someone always had to choose where the cuts would go. I had already made that choice once, and it had cost me my home. Now they wanted me to make it again and again in places I had never walked. Maybe that is justice. Maybe it is punishment dressed up as expertise. I do not tell myself pretty stories about redemption. I do not think of myself as the man who saved the city, or the man who doomed the villages. I am just the one who happened to stand in the intersection when the world was asked which part of itself it was willing to lose first. The interface is still out there, somewhere above or across or around. It tugs, and the planet gives. Asphalt, steel, flesh, traded for pieces of somewhere else. The suits may be gone for now, but the absence they carried has learned new ways to reach in. When the alarms in our facility buzz now, when a new splinter corridor blinks onto the global map, they turn to me. "Lieutenant Beckhoff," they ask, using the rank as if it still means anything out there. "Where should the line go?" I look at the map. I think of Dom 7, of Sarikuduk, of my village's neat gap in the earth, of the technician's arm, the worker's half-body on the tracks, the people I lied to and the ones I did not. Then I draw.